now we're going to talk about clause 4.3, which is basically the clause that talks about the scope of the information security management system. So the standard says that the organization shall determine the boundaries and applicability of the information security management system to establish its scope. So if a company is offering various services, the company has the ability to pick and choose which of those services and products it wants to include within the scope of its certification. Okay? And after you define the scope of certification, these activities will actually be written on your ISO certificate. So if, for example, you're an IT services company and you offer, for example, on-prem support or cloud support, for the sake of the example, and you want to get certified only for the cloud support, then your scope of certification might be something like provision of IT services for cloud support, just as an example. And as you can see, like that, we have included on-prem activities, meaning that your certificate won't mention that you're doing on-prem activities, and this would also mean that you're not going to be creating documentation for that particular topic. It's not going to be included in internal audits, nor will it be included in external audits. And when defining the scope of certification, we have to consider internal and external issues that directly relate to that particular part and aspect of your business. We're going to determine what the interested parties need from your organization when it comes to this particular aspect of your business. And we're also going to consider interfaces and dependencies between activities performed by the organization and those that are performed by other organizations. And this is a very important element, meaning that let's say that you're a larger organization and you're going to include in the scope of certification one department within the organization, for example, the IT department. What the standard is saying over here, that we're going to consider the interface between the organization and those that are performed by other organizations, which might be also other departments within the same organization. Then we're going to, for example, so back to my example, if we're an IT department within a larger organization getting ISO 27001, then we're going to consider, for example, HR as a supplier or a client of our services. Okay? So ultimately, what we're considering in this particular clause, clause 4.3, is to define what you're doing as an organization in a few words. Okay? So here we're going to write a summary. Typically, this would be 5 to 10 words, okay, to briefly explain what you do as a company. And we don't need to say what we're going to be excluding. We just need to say what we're going to include in our scope of certification. And effectively, nothing extraordinary needs to be done to meet the requirements of the standard. What you need to do is to add the scope of the ISMS, of the Information Security Management System, within your information security manual. Okay? How I like to do this is that over here we would have a section, and for example here, development and servicing of a KYC, customer lifecycle management platform. Or for example, it can be provision of IT services to the fintech industry, for example. So like this, we are further narrowing down what we're doing. And I find that the more you understand what you do as a company and who your niche client is, the better your services will be. So if you have that clarity of what is it exactly that you are offering and who are you offering it to, I would strongly suggest that you include it in your scope of certification, because then when one of your clients receives your ISO certificate and they notice that their industry is actually mentioned in your scope of certification, they're going to invariably have a positive reaction to such inclusion of their own industry within the certificate. Okay, so that is all that we have to do for this particular requirement, for this particular scope of certification. And as I've mentioned, it is very important to keep the scope as short as possible. Sometimes I see scope of certifications that are 20, 30, 40, and even 50 words long. I think that is too much, and it implies lack of clarity on what the company actually does. Okay? So the first thing that you're going to do to define your scope of certification is to understand what you are offering, what are your products and services that you're going to include within the ISO certification, and you're going to define what you're not going to include within the scope of certification. Okay? So if, for example, most of the revenue is generated from a single product or product line, focus on that. I'd start by first optimizing the most critical processes rather than diluting your energy on elements that aren't as important to your certification. I also wanted to mention that if you get certified for 3 out of the, for example, of your services, of your 10, so let's say that you have 10 services as a company, but you choose to start your certification process by including 3 of these services, you can extend the scope of certification to include other products and services further down the line. Okay, so there aren't any restrictions to that whatsoever. So some tips to keep it short and sweet, including, for example, that we have to have some type of, let's call it key activity. So you're provisioning a service, you're manufacturing, you're importing, you are setting up, you're performing customer service. Okay, you're going to include any necessary activities, so you're storing, transporting, designing, building, etc. different elements of activities within your value chain, and you might also want to include the product type and category. Okay, so how this would look in real life, we're seeing something like, for example, manufacture, storage and distribution of food products, or it can be import, install and commission IT networking systems or lifts or whatever, or ELV systems, provision of digital marketing services or provision of accounting services or provision of legal services. Okay, so as you can see, in a few words, we can deeply explain what you do as a company. And that is all when it comes to clause 4.3 of the standard. I hope that this was clear enough for you. As always, if you have any questions, just let me know. I'm always happy to help. Thank you so much.